Hello there. I'm just after getting off the phone with Daniel Kinahan. He just informed me that the biggest fight in British boxing history has just been agreed. Get him there, my boy! Big shout out, Dan. He got this done. Literally over the line. 2-fight deal. Tyson Fury versus Anthony Joshua next year. One problem. I'm just going to smash Deontay Wilder's face right in the next fight. And then we go into the Joshua fight next year. So there we are. Gypsy King versus AJ. It's on for next year. There's a hurdle in the road called the Bronx Bomber, aka the Knockout King, and I will get onto him and knock his spark out. And then we're on to the big fight. So big thank you, Dan, for getting this deal over the line. All the best. God bless you all. See you soon. Peace out.
Hey, welcome back to the number one podcast in the sport where I'm absolutely cooking. So I've got the windows open, which means you guys are going to get the full atmospherics for a change. I don't think I'll be able to edit them out. So if you get the odd siren, the odd kid screaming, apologies, but it's so hot, man. Like, I am absolutely cooking. So for reference, my internal temperature right now, as I'm sat here, 28.2 degrees is how hot this room is. And you can imagine what that's like to sit in and try and record, so bear with me. As I'm talking now, I have no idea what this is going to be called. I was going to do, why it's a good reason for John Palata to come back, amongst other things. But I think it's really about, I want to talk about the lost generation, because I took a phone call on Saturday night from the lieutenant of one of the three big promoters in this country. And he asked me a simple question: where's the next Dan Aziz? I was like, what do you mean? And he said, where's the next guy we can find from the shadows who can go on to win area, English, British, European, etc.? Where is that person? Where's the next guy coming through like that? And I was stuck. And then I started to wonder, why is it so hard to call? And I realized that those sorts of people who should be coming through like that had an unusual set of circumstances. And because of that, all of our boxing calendars are off. And what that means is a lot of the guys in their mid-30s are still having viable careers, because the guys that were meant to move them out were delayed. And they were delayed by the pandemic and the kind of long tail effects of the pandemic. So it's not even just a short period of time in which things were locked down, but it's that longer term effect as boxing started to right itself. And so we've got to ask ourselves, when did boxing right itself, and what are the real consequences of that? Now, if you remember 5 years ago, and 5 years ago today is probably when the episode I did with Larry went absolutely crazy, and which reminds me I need to do a 5-year anniversary of that one. I haven't even started the treatment for that, so I don't know when that one will be out, but I want to do that one, and I want to do it justice, and I want it to be good enough that you guys are going to go, oh, okay, there's another chapter to this. So I've got to go and find the little nuggets that, people appreciate and enjoy. So 5 years ago, I remember, I don't know if it was on my pod or it was with the New Age guys, and I remember saying, what you're going to see when boxing comes back is a lot of people getting stopped with body shots. I got laughed at. A lot of trainers said, whatever, mate, why? Most people thought it would be headshots, and I kept saying to people, the ability to take a body shot it's a skill. Why is it a skill? Because there's a lot of fine coordination that happens between the muscle groups that take the force from the body to the ground and keep it in the ground so it doesn't affect you. And I thought that would be the only thing the pandemic would kind of do. People are going to get stopped with body shots. If they're not doing the body sparring now, they're going to pay a heavy price. I remember saying this to Denzel, actually, when we were working together. I said, just keep taking body shots, because when you do come back online and start boxing again, that's where you're going to be vulnerable. But as it turns out, that actually wasn't the worst consequence of the pandemic. The worst consequence of the pandemic was the complete erosion of talent development. That quiet bit that doesn't get talked about, where guys get better by working together. Guys get better by fighting. Guys get better by doing shows, sometimes in front of a camera, sometimes not in front of a camera. And that got overlooked because we didn't know at the time. We'd never had that. But now that we can look back with the benefit of perspective, we now realize actually what happened between, I'm going to pick the years, right? So from about Feb 2020 to I reckon about summer 2022, so about 2.5 year period, I think was barren for boxing. And we didn't really start to pick up till I reckon the end of 2022. But it was barren, and people point to all the fights on BoxRec. I'm like, but it's not really about that. It's about what was happening down the pyramid. And the truth is we didn't really have a pyramid for a long time. It was probably an inverted pyramid because there was money at the top and no money at the bottom. So you have this inverted pyramid where you're having to work your prime assets, right? You have to work the guys who are experienced, who have the resources to A, manage a camp in COVID compliant protocols, and also promoters that have the money to do the shows in that way. And, you know, people fought abroad, Umar Sadiq being an example, Jermaine Brown being another one. But broadly speaking, the pyramid inverted in boxing and it shrunk. And we're now seeing the consequences of that because all those guys who are meant to be a kind of 28, 29, 30, where are they? These are the guys who should be world champions. And so, like, you know, I spent time talking to Porky about this and he goes, where are the world champions? I think the pandemic had a large effect on that. I'd have to look into this for the American side. And if you're American, feel free to let me know if I'm right on this. But because everything got delayed, everything got stopped. No one was developing. So a lot of guys who should have been developing in 2020, 2021 are only really developing from 2022, 2023 onwards. So they're all 2 years behind. So we've got this gap where there should be guys putting, you know, Josh Warrington to the sword. There should be guys putting Lee Wood to the sword that aren't 36-year-old Anto Kakache, and credit to him for winning. But the fact that we've got two guys with a combined age of over 70, and that's main eventing British TV, is a problem. It's why we still need Anthony Joshua for a couple of years. It's why we still need Tyson Fury for a couple of years. It's why we still need Chris Eubank Jr. for a couple of years. And these are guys who half a generation ago we'd have been saying, look, you got to hang it up. But they can't hang it up. A, because there's no one to challenge them, right? There's no one they fear coming through. You know, that next logical layer doesn't exist. And so why doesn't it exist? So an easy way to do this is to look at who was really bubbling in the amateur scene pre-pandemic, right? Let's start there. And then I'm going to say the names. And then in your head, just work out, are these guys really popping? What I mean by popping is you're confident they can fight for a world title this year, right? You could put them in there and they'd be competitive in a world title fight. That's the test. Yeah, because it's 7 years, right? It's 7 years since they won the national titles. Or actually, I should say be semi-finalists, because I think it's better to do the semi-finalists. Then we got a broader data sample. So we've got Conor Kelsall. We've got Ben Norman. We've got Hamza Mahmood. We've got Jake Harrison. We've got Brad Strand. We've got Liam Davis. We've got Akash Takir. We've got Mark Chamberlain, Dalton Smith, Isaac Milburn, Harris Akbar, Harvey Lambert, Jordan Reynolds, Ben Fale, Ben Reese, Patrick Allen Cripps, Bryce Goodridge, Callum Beardow, Lewis Williams, Nati Ngwenya, Courtney Bennett, Ches Nile. Okay? Of those names, there's some you'll recognize depending on how deep you are into the amateurs, but there's some you'll recognize through the pro ranks, right? Most people will be familiar with Brad Strand, Liam Davis, Mark Chamberlain. I think Frank Hoover, those guys are pretty quick. If you're a matchroom guy, you'll be familiar with Dalton Smith. If you kind of just love the sort of amateur scene, you'll be familiar with Harris Akbar, you'll be familiar with Jordan Reynolds. If you follow Denzel on social media, you'll know who Ben Fale is. If you follow this podcast, you know who Courtney Bennett is. The rest you might know, but you won't. But that's 2018. You would expect that the winners of our national title should be known to the public. we should know who these guys are, number one. Number two, if we had a normal development path, these guys would be a lot further ahead. And we're going to come back to the whys later, but let's look at that's 2018. That's 7 years ago. So let's go back to the last real championship we had before the pandemic. So if we look at 2019, we've got Connor Kelsall again. We've got Hamza Mahmood. We've got Ibrahim Nadeem. We've got Masood Abdullah. Now we're starting to hear names we're familiar with. We've got Amma Akbar. We've got Harvey Lambert. We've got Mark Dickinson. We've got George Crotty. We've got Karen Gilpin. We've got Nathan Ngwenyi. We've got Gideon Antwi, right? We've got Ben Litwin. We've got Connor Daly. We've got John O'Meara. We've got Joe Tyers. We've got Sam Noakes. We've got Elliot Whale. We've got Rampton Musa. We've got Aaron Bowen. We've got Ben Jarvis. We've got Thomas Pogson. We've got Delicious Ori. Okay? Those are the names from 6 years ago. 6 years ago. Right? Now, of those names, there's no one in that group, and if I offend people, apologies. There's no one in that group where you're like, yeah, that's the guy. And how do you know that? Because we're all fixated on Adam Azim, and we're all fixated on Italma, right? That tells you that the guys that the system was meant to deliver either weren't ready or weren't good enough. So why was that? So the theory I come up with about what happened was, at the end of that tournament, you had two camps of people. You had the Elliot Whale guys who were like, I'm not going to make GB. And you had the Delicious Ori guys who were like, I might make GB. Right? That was the split. If you're Delicious Ori, you're like, Fraser Clark's not doing another Olympics, I can slide in there. And that's one camp. If you're Elliot Whale, you're like 69's kind of deep. They already have Harris Akbar and guys like that there. Do I want to go through all of that? The answer is probably not. So Elliot was in a position where it's like, what do I do at this point? And he might have thought, let me go and win another title and then, see what I do from there. And then the guys in the middle, like a Courtney Bennett. And Courts was caught in this dilemma. So after 2018, I said to him, you're done with the amateurs. That was a conversation him and I had. But he said, nah, I reckon I can make GB and then get the Commonwealth Games after Fraser goes. And I was like, are you sure? Because that's a lot of years. I was like, you're committing 4 years to being in the system. And him and I had the conversation. See, I can't tell him what to do. If I'd had my choice, Courtney would have turned pro in 2018. And he'd be a pro 6 years deep now. And completely different situation. But he was caught in the middle. And there were others. And if you look on the women's side in that era, you had people like Raven Chapman, Nina Hughes, Georgia O'Connor might have been in the mix as well. And if you look at them, they've never really bubbled to the top either. So this was a problem across men's and women's boxing. Remember, this is the top tier of what the amateurs produce. So the first thing we'll talk about is at the top, people thought they could go and win another tournament. 2020 happened, no ABA. So you're not going to get the ABAs until as late as possible in 2021. And I don't even think you had them in 2021. Maybe 2022 was the first proper one. So if you waited in 2019 for the next one, you didn't box again until 2022. So you've blown 3 years. Like, these are 3 wasted years. And I think a lot of these talented kids fell into that trap of thinking there's always next year. Because no one knew what the future would hold, right? So when 2020 comes around and all the gyms shut, well, all right, some didn't shut, but most gyms shut down. And I know this from having talked to boxers. They didn't know what to do. Yeah, you're ticking over, but it's not, no fight date, no this, no that. People's weight went up. There was no commitment. So from about beginning of March, for about 2 years, boxing's momentum's broken. Unless you're one of the top names that makes money, boxing momentum's broken. This is where it starts to hit guys like your Robbie Chapmans, for example, guys like your Yusuf Kamaris who've already turned over, but it ain't working for them in that way because they're not getting the opportunities. Linus Adofias, they're not getting those opportunities. A lot of guys weren't getting opportunities. And this is where I can slide in to talk about John Palata. He's a great example of this. So John does the boxer tournament, if you remember, and doesn't go well in it. You know, it didn't suit him. It didn't suit where we were taking John style-wise, where we were trying to say to John, we need you to be patient in the first 3 rounds, let these guys tire themselves out, then you're going to start countering and taking them out. But I can talk about strategy and all that another time. So originally, before the pandemic, John was meant to fight for the Southern Area belt. Now, they wanted John on the B side, but they wanted the fight to be competitive. So they were okay with John winning. His opponent was meant to be David Adelaide. And they said, if John wins, we go with John. If Adelaide wins, we go with David Adelaide. John says, cool. Yeah? So Frank's like, first show back, we'll do that. Heavyweight Southern Area, we want to find out what David Adelaide's got. Cool. They offered the same thing to Adelaide. The answer was no. They offered it again. The answer was no. So then they said, okay, David's going to go another route. And then they said to John, do you want to jump in with Dom Akinladi for the Southern Area? He's like, yeah. And if you remember, that fight kept getting pushed down. But that fight was where John was going to have his thing. Once that didn't happen, and there were good reasons why it didn't happen, which isn't for the podcast, they moved on because they were like, well, the way we're going to make money is by wheeling out the big dogs, because we've got limited bandwidth now. We're doing stuff at the Royal Albert Hall. We're doing it in this location, that location, the BT Sports Studios as it were at the time. We've got limited slots, and what we're trying to do is maximize the opportunities for our project fighters, your Dubois, your Joyces, your Yards, etc. And that's understandable, right? You're like, okay, I get it. But now what does John do? What does John do? Because remember, you got the exemption if you had a fight coming up, not an exemption to just train. So now that development and that momentum starts to ebb and flow and starts to drift off. Now, for every John Palata, you can put another 30 or 40 boxers that were like, nah, I'm not doing this. And a lot of people drifted out the sport. A lot of journeymen drifted out because they weren't needed anymore. You know what I mean? But if you remember, because people failing COVID tests, you kind of had to be ready. And John was ready, but people was like, yeah, I'm not losing this opponent to fight him. Yeah, I can remember that as well. So this is problematic. There's not many slots available, right? Now look at the amateur side. Most people are basically saying to themselves, what's the point of the amateurs now? Yeah, like, I'm not waiting around, And now they're just like, if boxing comes back, I'm turning over, right? That's what people are saying. There's going to be no tournaments for ages. I'm just going to turn over. So remember, the top tier amateur guys are like, I can either try for the GB route next year, or I can try for the pro thing next year. GB's kind of there because they're prepping for the Olympics. The pro thing, as you can tell in the pandemic, slots are narrowed. Now, Team GB don't do the Olympics in 2020. So all those guys lose a year. Ben Whittaker loses a year. Fraser Clark loses a year. And the list goes on. Yafai loses a year. And we go down that list. Every one of those guys loses a year. And remember, for some of them, that's not their first Olympic cycle. So Yafai is not getting any younger. You know, if you remember, it was we stopped boxing in that last qualification event. And that's what I found really interesting. Those guys lost a year. So objectively, you either lost 1 year or 2 years, but you've lost your development years here for that generation of guys who should be monsters now. Because that's when your brain's most receptive to like really, really training. And so if you narrow that down and you start to look, by the time we get to 2022, we've got this talent vacuum of guys that should be further ahead than they are, but now they're not, and they're struggling against journeymen because the journeymen are like, well, I've got experience. You may have talent, but I've got experience. And it's easier to spin that back up than it is to spin talent back up. And you start to see that. These guys start to struggle. You know, a lot of those guys who turned pro too soon struggled. Their careers kind of disappeared. A lot of the Olympians, apart from maybe Yafai, have had a bumpy road. And people say it's because they're not good enough. No, their development was disrupted. That year or two they lost by effing and jeffing and by COVID was costly. Then there are the guys who gambled on making GB again or winning the 2020 ABAs. And maybe that's Elliot Wells' category. Maybe that's Courtney Bennett's category. And they kind of got the best of nothing. Because they probably should have turned over 2018 and they would have had at least a year and a half, 2 years of being in the pros. So that would have been your kind of development and seasoning mobilized. You had a couple of bumpy years, but because you had momentum, there was a chance you could have got on shows. So that never happened. So now you're seeing all of these guys come through now. And you're seeing someone like Courtney in 2025. And people are saying to me, why isn't he the guy you said he would be? And I'm like, he lost 2 really critical years to COVID and also a poor decision to try and make GB. But it was an understandable decision with foresight, but a bad decision with hindsight. And you can only judge someone on what they knew at the time. So with Courts, I always felt 2018 was a perfect time for him to turn over. He would have been about 22. And then all we would have done is have him fight and then just put him in every camp going. Chisora, Dillian, Joshua, Fury. Have him in every camp. That was what I kept talking about, this accelerated development of just taking him from really, really good amateur, dominant amateur, to then being that pro who understands what the adjustment is before setting him loose on the world. But look, you can't always get it how you want it. But the beautiful thing is, because he doesn't have miles on the clock, he still has time. And, you know, I think the next couple of moves that he makes will be important. Let's go back to John, because John's 35, 36 now. So he's in that generation with your Warringtons, your Joshuas, your Kakachis. He's in that generation. Do you know what I mean? They've shared shows together, etc., etc. And so I can tell you this because obviously John and I have stayed close. John was heartbroken that he never got his opportunity during the pandemic. Didn't get to fight Adelaide, didn't get to fight Akinladi, guys he felt he would beat. And so he went off and did his own thing, became a businessman, got some successful businesses going. They're viable. He's happy. Family man now. But he every time I spoke to John, I knew the boxing itch was still there. And we'd speak, and I knew he was still training, so still keeps in good shape, good condition. And there've been a couple of aborted comebacks. I think he just sort of aligned with people who couldn't deliver to his standards and expectations. So then I hear that he's coming back. So I think John will fight in June, because John and I talk, obviously. And I was happy for him because I said to him, this exact thing I've just said in the pod, I said to John, I said, I don't think there's anyone that's come after you that's going to be a threat to you. And I said, that's why guys like you, Nick Webb, Warrington, Joshua, Fury, Kakachi, we're going to mention now, and all of those guys who were born between like 87, 88 and like 92. That's why those guys are still viable in the sport now, because there's that development vacuum. And promoters are like, we need to stick with what's working right now until someone can come and upset the apple cart. And that's how John's looking at it. John's view is the same people I'd have had to have beaten 5 years ago, I have to beat now. There's no one new that would worry me. I'm like, fair enough, logical. Now, if he's thinking that, I'm sure Joshua's like, the people I have to fight are the same people I had to fight years ago. I've still got to fight, what's his name? Wilder. I've still got to fight Fury. If I want to fight Usyk again, I want to fight Usyk, but these are all old men. No one's forcing me to go and fight these 24, 25-year-olds. Fury's feeling the same way. These young guys, these Jared Andersons, ain't going to catch us up. And if they're not going to catch us up, why don't we keep fighting each other? The fans almost don't have a choice. We're the best out there right now. And that's what I think has happened in boxing. I'm trying to think to the American side, because if you look at kids like Ammo Williams, if you look at kids like Jared Anderson, they would validate that. But then I look at guys like Keyshawn Davis, who kicks the idea up in the air, but he was well backed. Richard Torres Jr., well backed. Troy Isley, to an extent, well backed. Shakur Stevenson sits outside there because he turned pro before. But if you weren't well backed, you kind of disappeared. And that's why if you look at America, it's not deep either in that middle tranche. It's not super deep. But actually, no. Let's play the same game with the Americans. And let's look at who won national titles in 2018. Okay. Feel free to just thumbs up anytime that these names are familiar to you. Abraham Perez, Michael Angeletti, Duke Reagan, Ray Ford, Dallas Cabiepu, can't even say his name, Keyshawn Davis, Freudis Rojas, Marcus Valle, Troy Isley, Javier Martinez, Atif Obilton, can't even say these names, Raheem Gonzalez, Adrian Tillman, Jared Anderson, Richard Torres, and Amisael Jimenez. We don't really know these guys. There's a few of them we know. We know Richard Torres, obviously, he's working his way through. But think about that. We're still calling Richard Torres a prospect in 2025 because of that delayed Olympics. That was a big deal. Troy Isley probably lost that year as well. Keyshawn Davis is the only guy that seems to have overcome that. Ray Ford, I know people say he's been active, but he's good, but not wow. Of that group, there's only one with the wow factor, right? We can agree on this, and that's got to be Keyshawn Davis for the speed that he's worked at. Same problem, though. So how do you solve this problem is the real question. I have no idea how you solve this problem. I don't know if you can. I think you almost have to, this is going to sound callous, but you almost have to write this generation off and say who's coming next. And I don't like saying that because I think everyone deserves a chance, but you either have to write them off or there has to be an accelerated development program where these guys are fighting twice a month. No, at this point, people probably, if you haven't turned off at this point, you're probably saying to me, maybe it's just a bad generation. It happens every so often. It's like, no, that's not a bad generation. That was a decent enough generation where we should have had guys from that generation, especially the bigger guys, fighting for the British and stuff. And we didn't. You know, look. Let's just reel off guys of that generation, right? Steve Robinson, Jamie TKV, Courtney Bennett, as I've said before, Ches Nile, who tried the pro thing, it wasn't for him either. And you can list all of these guys who were around. Delicious Ori was floating around as well. They've never developed. Like, they were really good amateurs, and then something just happened, and it has to have been the lack of ability to train and develop in the standard model of boxing. It has to have been that, and this is what we're paying the price for. And if you're saying to me, which is going to be the generation, it's tough. So I'll speak from a Fitzroy Lodge perspective because that's what I was close to. We tried to stay as busy as we could. Right, we tried to keep the gym as open as we could for more social reasons than actually boxing reasons. You know, some kids need a safe haven. Like, you can't be in a house locked down if the household is violent and or abusive. So that's why we did it. So a lot of our lads didn't stop training like a lot of others did. And so when boxing came back on stream, they looked really good because they'd kept the consistency up. And then what happened year after year, everyone got back up to speed, and then it became more competitive. And a lot of those boys should have gone pro probably 2023. But they also hung around too long. But in doing so, they got to see the struggles of the pre-pandemic generation and were like, there's no point because we're only going to come in behind these guys. So we have to wait our turn. And that means earning crap money for another 3 or 4 years. A lot of people didn't want to do that. And so there's been this knock-on effect. It happened in the amateurs, as I've just mentioned. It happened on the small hall scene where a lot of guys are like, there aren't enough slots. Because there was a period, wasn't there, where the board was like, you can't have more than, it might have been like 9 or 10 fights. There was a cap on how many fights you could actually have. So there's like, it's not even that the number of total fights went down. It was the number of total fights went down. the number of available slots on every fight card went down. So you had this exponential destruction of opportunity. And look, you've seen guys like Dennis Retreat, guys like Errol Johnson do fewer shows. Everyone's just done fewer shows because the economics don't add up anymore. And so just that development, that our pyramid is screwed. And no one talks about this in boxing. But if we don't fix the pyramid as a matter of urgency, which means making the amateur competitions matter again. And this has to be something the professional side gets involved in now. Because if we don't make it worthwhile for these kids to train their nuts off, we're not going to have guys come through. Because when you lose that momentum, your new normal goes down in terms of quality. And so people aim for that lower bar when we need to be raising that bar. And look, people aren't going to want to hear me say this. You might have to give prize money for the winners of the national titles. You might have to start giving out prize money at box cups and stuff. You might have to make it worth people's while to get stuck in. And the reason I say that, and I'm going to drift off topic here, if you look at what's happened in American college sport, which was traditionally amateur, they've got a thing called an NIL deal, name, image, likeness, right? It's like image rights in football. And it means that you can be sponsored. So a sponsor can use your name, image, and likeness for commercial endeavor, right? Which means you're not being paid to play sport. You're being paid to be a famous sportsman. It's a distinction that means it still kind of keeps things amateur in a way without it keeping it amateur. Now, look, you can get NIL deals in college now for $5 million, which would be more than some people would make going to the NFL or the NBA. And so what you're now seeing in college is people going, I'm not declaring early for the draft because economically I'm better off being here for longer. And there's no guarantee I'm going to make it over there. So why am I going to give up my NIL deal when I'm good here? And we don't know where this is going to go. Does this now mean it's financially viable for athletes to do a master's and a PhD? So you do 6 years in college on an NIL contract at $5 million a year, make your 30 mil, go off into the civilian world and make money. Or if that doesn't work, you can still go into the sport and play. And like by analogy, something similar might need to happen in boxing, where we make it lucrative enough to be an amateur like GB have, where you'll stick around longer, drive the standards up, and improve the quality. Now, I don't know if that's a viable answer or not. Like, where would the amateur side get the money from? And this is where I guess the pro side must contribute. If you're telling me that between Eddie Hearn, Ben Shalom, Frank Warren, and whoever else we need to pull in, maybe a Sauerland, these guys can't put money into a pot, and that's just the England boxing, this is just a prize money pot. The winner of every weight class in the ABA's male, female, doesn't matter, is going to get $5,000. The runner-up is going to get $2,500. Semi-finalists get $1,000 each. Let's start there. Yeah, let's just keep it really simple. Start there. I don't think that's going to cost more than like $100,000 a year. But it's an investment in growing the sport. And if you split that 3 ways, that's not hurting anybody. But without that, I just don't think kids are going to want to do this. It's all very well putting the stuff on TV, but if there's no bread to show for it, if there's no show me some material things. And I don't want to hear this, you should do it for the love of the thing. No. You can love something and get paid for it. Like, the two are not mutually exclusive. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't believe you can make money doing something you don't love. Not any kind of top level, no. But that's the thought I'll leave you guys with. How do we fix it? Because we definitely have a talent vacuum. Because if we can keep recycling guys and having guys like Kid Galahad come back, and there's no irrational reason for him not to. We've got Manny Pacquiao coming back because he's looking, going, no one's really come online I need to be worried about. That's not to say he'll win, but the fact that he feels that way lets you know where the standards are. And it has to be this kind of effect of the pandemic and that long tail thing of having to grow the sport again in terms of opportunities for fighters and trying to reset that pyramid so that it's bottom heavy, not top heavy. This feels like an odd episode overall. I wanted to say this because I don't think we've ever really looked at boxers from that perspective. Because we kind of say, oh, he was never any good or he's not talented. But I think a lot of times boxers weren't given the opportunity to develop between 2020 and 2022. And if you lose those development years, it's hard to get them back. It's like this. Can you imagine having a kid and you delay your kid's ability to read, write, and speak for 2.5 years, right? Let's just say you delay it. What's going to happen when that kid goes to school? They may look the same physically, but that kid is just not going to perform at the same level as everybody else. He goes up to year 2. The year 1s are probably more capable than he is. Year 3, the year 1s might still be more capable than he is. And then they all go past him or her. And that's how we want to look at this. So I think we need some kind of intervention. I don't know what that is. It feels like prize money in the amateurs. But I don't know. Maybe it's pro-am shows. I don't see why we're still resisting these, by the way. I think these are the most logical solution to a lot of these problems. I'm sure if you talk to Frank, if you talk to Eddie, they'd love to put the amateurs on. Why? Because it's not that expensive, number one. Number two, it gives you a chance to have a look at these kids before you got to sign them and really commit to them. 3, if they're good, you already have a profile, you've got momentum. And I don't see why we don't do it that way. But that was just a bit of a brain dump today. Just wanted to share that because I don't think we look at it from that perspective. But I do think actually internationally boxing has suffered from the pandemic in a way that maybe other sports haven't. And I'll say take care, guys.